Many people have problems with art and not with reality.
So why is art different?
It's pretty simple, right?
This is knowledge, this is thinking, this is thought.
Yeah, it does something strange with your head.
Welcome to the Undergang Armchair.
Bring it.
Welcome to the Undergang Armchair. My name is Ando. Hello, friends. Welcome indeed to another episode. We are steadily creeping up towards number 100 here, which is pretty wild. The show's been going for a little more than 3 years. My, how time flies. And not to get all maudlin on you, but thank you for being here and being along for the ride. It's obviously been a little shaky here, you may have noticed, but we're working hard on getting the show back onto some sort of semblance of regular. For example, we're heading up to Stockholm next week to talk to a bunch of people in conjunction with the market and supermarket art fairs. And if you have any suggestions, know any people up there who you think we should talk to, please let us know. Contact information is on our website, undergang.net. We have the very interesting Matthias Borello on today. He's a writer, a curator, an editor, and many of you guys here in Denmark probably know him from the online publication Kunsten.nu. They're one of the big arts publications here in Denmark, and they do a lot of critical writing and discussion about arts. It's actually a great site, so I would check that out if you don't know about it. And that makes him a very visible person in the Danish arts scene. So he's here to talk about how he got there, about a bunch of the projects he works on, about critical discourse. We got to a lot of different interesting subjects. And it's killer stuff, so let's get right to it. Enjoy. Have you been on the radio before?
Yeah, several times.
I'm not claiming this is the radio, but
no. But I've actually been used like as a representative of the arts a lot of times.
That's what I imagine.
And the national broadcast have they have used me several times, and AK 24/7 has actually done a lot of shows based on columns that we published on Kunsten.nu, so they kind of redid the column live.
They radiofied it.
Yeah.
Was that interesting? Did you like that format?
At times. Because, if you get the time, it's always interesting to discuss art, you know. But if they just want to adopt the good story, it's not worth it, really.
The one that hopefully makes some debate and talk. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of that. How does it feel to be the person who has to represent Danish arts?
It's normally in the case of cultural framing that I have to represent the arts and discuss it, discuss the meaning of it, discuss the importance of it, discuss the provocation it might produce, and at those times it seems meaningful. Also because in general, the thing I've been doing as an editor and art critic at Kunsten.nu has been to try to qualify the general discusnn and dialogue about contemporary arts.
Which is hard.
But I wouldn't have done it if I didn't, and stayed with it if I didn't like it. So, I like debating and I like discussing, and I truly believe that, discussion is a very, very formative tool for like a culture. You could maybe call it civilization, you know. But in that way, I feel, as an art critic and editor, I feel very connected to an idea of enlightenment in a way. And I guess I think of the arts as the most important field of discussing our like daily lives, our behavior, our way of treating each other, beside of politics, of course.
I'm really happy to hear that,
because it's like to me, it's like the echo chamber where you're free to choose your media in a way, to make the most efficient kind of statement, or not statement, but I mean,
a communication of some sort.
Yeah, I mean, and normally art is some sort of like deep communication about something, you know. And if you get people to listen, it's very, very obvious that they are blown away about it when they get there. You know, it's like it's actually very. It's a very privileged role, actually, to be the one, you know, pointing towards the few doorknobs and small coatings that might lie there and open that door, you know, because you really get a feeling of people suddenly engaging in bigger questions right in front of you, you know. But of course, I mean, normally I write stuff, you know.
Right.
It's not that often that I actually have that conversation, but I have, like, on the radio and
I'm sure you
in other medias. And when I stroll the Danish art scene, of course, artists and cultural people love to discuss arts. So, I mean, and actually I like that.
All fucking day, yeah.
Yeah. And it's very few people I feel that I have to stop, you know.
Well, I mean, one of the things that kind of corresponds, like, in something I've been thinking a lot about, my friend Kevin pointed out, is that art is one of the few things which really has to defend its own existence and meaning in the world all the time. Soccer gets way more public funding than arts does, let's just say in Denmark. And it doesn't have to address its own reason for existing. It's a given that this is a good thing, that soccer is good for children, it's good for team building, it's good for society, it's good for everything. And they barely have to address issues of violence, sexism, homophobia, you know, all those sort of things that, you know, I'm not interested in discussing it, but the point is they're not even asked publicly to do that. Whereas art is asked every, let's say, 4.5 months, why do you exist? Why should we care? Why should we give money to this? What is it good for? Who are you talking to? All these sort of things come up again and again and again and again. And it's nice to hear you instead just say, yeah, no, I think it's one of the most important things that we do as humans.
Yeah, but I mean, it's like that. And I think, you know, there have been like statistics saying that, well, I guess it was like a few years ago, it was, there was a survey saying that there were actually more people going to museums than football.
Really?
Like soccer.
In Denmark or in the world?
Yeah, in Denmark.
Okay.
So it's like, okay. So actually, even though we publicly feel like we have to argue for the importance of what art is and is doing, people go there. because they like it.
Yeah.
I mean, and they like the. I think they like the inspiration and that, like inspirational echo chamber that art is, where they pause their lives and think about stuff and indulge in aesthetics, and the other thing is, and I think maybe that's the more polemic take on what you're saying, is that artists and art professionals have been bad at addressing the functionalities of art, and it's a taboo almost to talk about functionalism and art in
Absolutely.
that way. So, and I mean, I actually think it's pretty important that we address those qualities and in a way also kind of move on from this idea of like the artistic autonomy as something holy,
right?
Because it isn't,
right?
And I mean, there's a very big group of artists out there that are fully aware of what their works are able to in different contexts at different times with different people. They are fully aware of the functions of their practice.
Yeah.
And it's also, in a way, it kind of connects to this question of art as work as well. If you don't do anything, I mean, and if you can't tell anybody what you're doing, and you just want to keep it like, keep it like a weird mystery what you're doing, then it's very hard to argue for support and recognition and
well, it's seen as so not working class, right? It's not supposed to be tied to any sort of concepts of money or survival or capitalism. It's beyond that. It's pure. It's more wholesome. Mm-hmm. And that way it makes the discussion really awkward about a lot of reality, which is like
it's bullshit.
It's absolute bullshit. But we've gotten so far away from maybe some original ideas about art being a craft, mm-hmm. because that's now seen down on. That making pottery, which also has a function, is not art. Mm-mm. It's just not accepted in the cultural idea of what fine art is. It's nice. I like a nice coffee cup, but I'm not going to go to a show of coffee cups.
No,
and the state's not going to give that exhibition space a couple $100,000 to organize that. Mm-mm. Unless it's a very well-known museum or some other argument comes.
And I mean, if we truly believe that art can research matters in our culture and political life and stuff like that, I mean, then it should show itself as a resource in that way. It's I mean, and there is a lot of artists working deeply with that function of art as a research, a way of archiving, a way of proposing other social models, proposing different kind of city development, other kinds of behaviorism in social life, media, So I think these things are connected in the question of recognizing art as important work,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Before we go too far in that way, I do want to quickly find out where it came from for you, where your interest in art began and your studies, and what led you to the point you're at now.
Mm-hmm. To me, it's a little hard to actually point out, but
there was no moment.
Yeah,
no
I don't know.
specific
I've had big moments with art through my childhood. I was raised by a mom that was a very kind of culturally seeking individual, and she included me in a lot of stuff. I was taken to weird workshops in a very early age, and I was exposed to the theater of the Odin Theater.
Oh yeah, the very famous experimental theater in Denmark.
Yeah, and I had I've played drums all my life, drums and percussion, and I think I had big moments in maybe the field of performance, music, dance. Through that.
So you grew up in Jutland?
I did, in Holstebro.
Yeah, which is where the Odin Theater is based, right?
Yeah. So, and I've fairly recently, in the summer of 2014, I did a festival during the festive week in Holstebro, which were actually about coming back to your roots. And try to adopt the artistic language that you have developed after traveling, after moving from Holstebro to professionalize your artistic life. And then we invited artists to come back and adopt that language in their hometown for a week.
That's fascinating.
And it was just called Return. And I think for a lot of us, that also kind of, and that was a huge part of the project, was just to kind of bring some people together who have had this kind of same parallel history, and try to discuss what happened and why did we leave, and what did we think of Holstebro as, a place while being away, and how did it feel to come back and try to adopt that artistic language that we kind of maybe owe to guys like the Odin Theater or others, or the very, very good musical school that have raised a lot of very, very good musicians in Denmark as well. So that was a project questioning that. So for me, I guess my childhood exposed me to some great artists, I think. And before moving to Western Jutland, I lived in Humlebæk, and had experiences on Louisiana and some local theater as well at that time. But I mean, as a more professional thing, I started studying ancient Greek. But
why? Tell me why. What happened there?
It was kind of I guess I was confused about where to begin.
Yeah.
And I was obvious. I mean, I was. It was very clear to me that I was kind of a humanistic studies guy, and I didn't really know where to start. I was very interested in anthropology and ethnology, but I didn't have the grades to get directly into that, and then I was like, I remember in high school I was very interested in archaeology, and there was something there. And then I just thought, okay, well, the European cultures kind of started there, so why shouldn't you? You know,
Right.
and then I started there, and it was like 1 year of hardcore Latin and Greek studies. Like, and the first year was crazy, and you know, we were kind of, I think we were like 36 students starting that year, and we were 8 or something that actually went for the exam in the end, or maybe we were 15, and then 8 that actually continued on the on ancient Greek or Latin. But at that institute, I mean, I met some very inspiring and also almost frightening, you know, scholars, you know, people that has just been, you know, been into mathematical forms in Socratic dialogues for 20 years, or notations from Byzantine for flutes, you know, like, and has, you know, studied that
deep knowledge of
deep
crazy
knowledge.
Things.
Yeah. So I was a little scared of that place, and I felt a little claustrophobic.
Yeah.
But then I guess I was introduced to some of the more philosophical sides of kind of Greek culture, and I started studying some of the cultural theoretical texts, Herodotus, and some of the aesthetical texts,
right? Art and
kind of art, very early art theory, and something kind of something blew up in my mind, I guess.
Yeah.
And then I kind of followed that thread and started taking some classes on ethnology, on cultural theory. I took some like aesthetical theory classes on art history, and I started following a thread that later became clear to me that I was very interested in aesthetics, aesthetical theory and cultural theory, and how they kind of merged or had correspondences all through history. So I ended up doing my candidate on modern culture and communication, writing on social practices, contemporary artistic practices within the social field.
So when you open that door, there's a lot there.
There's a lot there, and I guess I ended up in social practices and the questions of quality. Mm-hmm. That was my kind of final thesis I did. Because it, to me, was the obvious case of where aesthetics kind of were challenged to its full. You know, the question of how you can adopt ethics and aesthetics in a way, and to me that was kind of the big fucking question of what I was interested in within arts.
I imagine it still is.
It still is.
I imagine you didn't find an answer.
Not really, or I think I found some answers, and I think I tried to adopt them, but in the same process I also realized that it is kind of full-time engagement and adoption that has to be dynamic to what happens in the social field and what happens in the artistic field, and it's a kind of a theoretical task or critical task to be sensitive, like contextual, socially, artistically sensitive and analytical. Yeah. You know, and that's your tool. So, and if you take those tasks seriously as both as a kind of day-to-day art critic, but also as a kind of artistic theorist, which I also try to be at times. I published a book in 2015 about art as social practice and taking its kind of leap from the practices of a Danish artist, Kenneth Balfeldt, who has done several very big and discussed and important social practice works in a Danish context.
Recently, or?
Yeah, and recently. I mean,
never heard of this individual.
Okay. But that's a huge mistake in a way. And it shows the importance of that we actually did that book to me. And I think there has been his practice is hard to deal with for a lot of the bigger institutions, and they haven't. And it kind of shows that there's some flaws in adopting social practice in a Danish context and the language of it. The National Gallery has bought parts of a project that he did with the Danish artist Foss at the Shelter for Men in Istergade. They kind of made a huge refurbishment of the Shelter for Men there in a long period stretching from like 2006 to 10.
It's funny, I heard about that, but I only heard about Foss. I didn't hear about Kenneth.
Okay, but I think Kenneth was like a huge part of that project, and he made in 2002 he did an art project in an old bunker where he installed a functional injection room for drug users in Vesterbro as well. And that project was a social practice project. He came from Goldsmith and had developed his practice abroad, obviously. That project ended up pushing political matters, and today we have like an injection space there.
A beautiful one.
Yeah, and I mean, his project started that,
right.
At that time.
Well, it's funny because I think actually I've heard about his projects and not him.
Yeah.
So in a way,
I think you've heard about Fixerup.
Yeah, I definitely have.
Yeah.
So I think that in a way his projects were so meaningful that they weren't attached to the cult of personality, which art often is, where you're like, oh, that's a so-and-so.
And that's the stronghold of his practice, that he becomes almost invisible in its afterlife.
Wild.
And a recent project is that he facilitated the kind of rehousing of beer drinkers in public space at Inghavepladsen, which were, they were moved away. Their kind of public square where they used to hang out was kind of taken away from them in a way, you could say.
Where the skate park is on the corner?
Yeah. There was a huge square there where they kind of hang out, and that was their social space. That was their kind of daily life. And the municipality didn't really, get into... They didn't get into solving that problem, and the beer drinkers was fully aware of the problems they might cause in public space by moving to different spaces and being in kind of a contest of the use of public space. So they were actually fully aware of their problem, and Kenneth started a dialogue, and then he became kind of the mediator and engaged an architect and the municipality in a project where he actually drew and built like a new space for the beer drinkers with them.
That structure there.
That very, very long bench with a pavilion.
So again, I know him, but
and
I
a
don't
urinal.
know him.
And if you go there, they will tell you they built the place themselves, and they would be immensely proud of it.
Yeah.
But it's actually an art project made by Kenneth Belfield.
That's wild. I mean, you got to say that's an amazing way to have a practice, right? Because it goes against so much of what we've learned about art, which that it is a personality and a selling of the self in relation to the actual work you do too.
Yeah.
You know, and you're constantly told that you have to. No one will do it for you. You have to do it yourself. You have to, and he does that, but without attaching it to this carriage of. I signed this. I made it. Now it's worth it.
Yeah, but I mean, he's one of the figures that a guy like me professionally can point to and say, well, here you have one of the very unique examples of social practice right here in Denmark, and there's a lot of other artists among him. I mean, he's one among many that works like that. But he's just a very, very good example because his practice changed stuff. You know, like, and you can go over there and you can see how it's used in your daily life, in public,
not in a museum.
No, exactly. Right. So, and I mean, I've on that interest, I have built it also kind of a parallel curatorial practice for myself. I mean, did a project in Tingbjerg in 2012, actually kind of co-curated a festival with 22 artists doing pieces in Tingbjerg. With Kenneth.
And Tingbjerg, just for context, is a so-called poor ghetto area.
Yeah, it was made it was drawn and built in the late 50s, so it's very early social housing and very idealistic architectural project made by Sten Eiler Rasmussen, which was like one of the very, very big architects and city planners at that time.
Was it one of the ones removing people out of the center of town?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, from the Black Square, Nørrebro, and like moved them to facilities that was kind of luxurious at that time.
Right, because people are living stacked on top of each other.
Yeah.
Sharing toilets out in the yard, all that.
Yeah, it was bad in here, actually, you know. And people moved out there. It was a green area. It has, I guess, the first adventure playgrounds in Denmark, you know, like, and it's still there. And it's, I mean, in a way, it could have been known for a lot of very, very nice things. But, I mean, through the last 15 years, or actually while Sten Eiler Rasmussen still lived, it already became stigmatized. Because you placed like people in like this very dense area, and of course there were things happening when you gather like at that time almost 10,000 people in an area. Of course things happen, and then it becomes this thing about, oh, now there have been trouble again in Tingbjerg. You know, it became very fast.
The angry youth
and the press already at that time started to kind of address the place in that kind of stigmatizing way, which kind of just grew, you know, by time. But that has been one of my first big curatorial projects. That was Visit Tingbjerg, which actually was about like try to revisit Tingbjerg, and try to look at what that history is, you know.
Which is to play off the name, they have Visit Denmark and visit all these other nice idyllic places.
So it plays on like almost untasteful tourism, but in a way also really means, hey, try to visit, like...
You're making me want to go there. I've never been there.
No, you should go. And I mean, there are still pieces out there, and very nice ones left from 2012. And then I've done like other curatorial projects. The last one was a project. I mean, I had a curatorial role within Copenhagen Art Week that Kunsten.nu has been doing for several years.
I have all you guys, right?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, it's more like a big cooperation between everybody on the art scene here. But of course, you need some kind of curatorial take on it. And I mean, I've been a part of that, and we organize it. Yes,
it's a big job.
It is
a lot of shit happening that week.
There is, and I mean, gladly, it's moving on from year to year, and people adopt the format. And it kind of it generates a lot of energy now. I think people think about, well, couldn't we do this project during Copenhagen Art Week? Mm-hmm. Oh, it could be nice to do this and this, and they reflect on the focus or theme that we kind of address this year, and they play ball, and it's slowly I think like becoming this kind of big collective effort.
Each year it's bigger and bigger.
Yeah, I think
consciousness
so.
About
it. And in a way, it's kind of the opposite of this kind of commercial profiling that's adopted with art fairs like Chart Art Fair and things like that, where of course an art scene needs kind of a commercial driver of a sort, to bring in collectors and art professionals, blah blah, but
cash money
but for the few, I guess. But in a way, it seems to me very meaningful to adopt this very collective format at the same time to make the scene come together as well, not just be like the profiled ones celebrating themselves in Charlottenborg.
Yeah. It has to be. They should, in theory, be equally strong, right?
Mm-hmm.
The commercial and non-commercial, the collective versus individualistic, all that sort of stuff. Because it's true, the money does actually need to be there, mm-hmm. as much as we don't like that, mm-hmm. and people really don't want to engage with that. It is absolutely a driving force,
mm-hmm.
and it has to be there. But we also need to remember the other side of things.
Mm-hmm. And I guess to me it's almost like art scene based social practice that we are doing with Copenhagen Art Week to try to address questions of public engagement and other values that are competing at that time with like cold cash, and address some other values that are more content, socially, publicly based.
But it seems that beyond even Copenhagen Art Week, you this is what Kunsten.nu does, and Kunsten.nu is a web-based publication, mm-hmm. which is serves as a critical arm, informational news arm.
Yeah.
You guys publish a podcast. Mm-hmm. You publish books, right?
No.
Okay.
We don't.
Can you tell me a little bit about why it started and what your role is with it?
Yeah. After university, I I ended up in an internship at the daily newspaper Information.
Which is a left-wing large newspaper.
Yeah, and has a fairly strong cultural practice, I think, among the daily newspapers in Denmark. And I was an intern on kind of the cultural section. And I was there for 4 months, and I got a lot of responsibility. And actually, visual arts or contemporary art was not taken by anyone. You know, all the press releases was kind of piled up in the aisle, and I realized that slowly that I could just maybe start picking up those things I found interesting in that pile, and shortly discuss the interesting perspectives of that story with the editor, and I got a kind of a license to go along some of those stories, and I developed almost instantly, like, I think I found like a journalistic format where I could adopt some of the cultural aesthetical theories that I was building through my studies.
You had no idea that journalism was a way forward, or was that kind
of... I think I had a class on cultural journalism at the university, and I really liked it. So I was not in doubt when I was to take like an internship how I should use that. So I thought of like cultural sections in the newspapers, and I was aiming at the best one in my eyes at that time. So, but then after the 4 months, they asked me to be the editor of like a spread, a weekly spread in the cultural section on art and form.
Wow.
Like an aesthetical spread, that could adopt on visual arts, contemporary art, architecture and design. And I could, run it with a weekly nod from the editor when I explained this week's spread. And
4 months out of university, and you get offered a job at a newspaper as an editor. That's wild.
It was wild. And I was working far too much to make that run. Also because I didn't just start writing myself. I tried to build up kind of a section of its own with 5 people writing on visual arts, one writing on architecture, and 2 that were addressing or writing on design. I started to grow up my own kind of small cultural section.
You're actually a boss in that section.
Yeah, in a way. And I had that spread for 2 years. And then it was closed down because of lack of money. And then, of course, that was the first one to cut.
Right. That's always the first one.
It is. But I had already started a dialogue with a guy in Aarhus called Jan Falk Borup, who ran Aarhus.nu, which were at that time a parallel to Copenhagen, a web-based magazine here in Copenhagen. He started one out in Aarhus called Aarhus.nu, and it was compared to Copenhagen, it was critical and had like a critical profile, and was very focused on that. And I had a lot of sympathy for that project. And actually, I did an interview with Jan Falk Borup in the spread in 2006, I think. And then, we decided to cooperate on making Aarhus.nu into Kunsten.nu and make it like a kind of a national media with an editorial office in Aarhus and in Copenhagen. And then I was the editor to run the East editorial office in Copenhagen, and another editor, Ole Bak Jacobsen, was to run the editorial office in Aarhus. And then Jan was kind of the administrative CEO of it.
Mm-hmm. And it should be said now at that point, there isn't really anything comparable in Denmark. You mentioned earlier Copenhagen. They function very much as a listing site where you can find out all the openings. You can find, there's some interviews, there's some content, but a lot of it is straight informational. What's on this week? What's happening on Friday? What openings are there on Friday, etc.
Yeah.
And you guys came in at a much more, dare I say, academic, but I mean at least writerly discussion, debate.
We had definitely a focus on, again, as I said in the very beginning, with a pretty clear aim that the discussion is, and the debate is, a way of qualifying language about something. So we had a very, very clear idea of what Kunsten.nu should, with its reviews and with its coverage in general, was to start out a qualified dialogue on contemporary arts. So we have tried to do that. I mean, and that has been the big goal of it. And I mean, in that occasion, Copenhagen Art Week is also a way of try to open doors, like open doors qualitatively for a larger public and have that discussion, but at the spaces as a part of the art scene, as a natural part of Copenhagen cultural life.
Well, you guys did it. I mean, you guys are now, I would say, established, and of course you're always working towards something, but you are now one of the big two media, art media in Denmark, and you definitely don't really, in my mind, compete with anybody in terms of what you do.
No, I think actually, we think of each other as competitors in many ways, like Copenhagen and Kunstkritik maybe. But I think we have a very clear notion of what each other's are doing and where our kind of strong profile is, and I think we're all getting good at that, like. And I hope they also recognize Kunsten.nu for that. I think they do deep down, somewhere. I'm pretty sure. And I mean, of course, there's a special thing about Kunsten.nu and the goal of having that kind of dialogue that make some clear, tasks that you have to write. Like your language has to adapt to a larger public. If you want to expand your public, then you have to, keep a language around what art is and what art does in a way that can engage people outside of the kind of core of art professionals in the country.
It's a tricky line to dance.
It's truly tricky, and of course then you also have to take the debate when it's there and meet up in the radio and have that maybe silly discussion on why Bob Dylan is a bad artist. In visual arts.
Oh, right. Why his paintings shouldn't be hanging in the National Gallery.
Yeah, for example. I guess that was one of the early radio programs I was participating in at AK 427, I guess. And you do those, because of course it's you think of it as a way of qualifying, maybe in a long term, but it is, and I think right now there's a very good palette of medias that. Web-based medias that are doing different things at times and covering different things, and I guess for Kunsten.nu it's very important that we are present in the whole country, like that we have the actual editorial office in Aarhus and in Copenhagen.
Well,
and
God knows people kind of have abandoned. Copenhagen. It's so Copenhagen central, everything. So it's good to have
I mean, and art coverage has kind of suffered for that. Always, I guess. That it's kind of capital, based in a way. And I mean, there's a lot of very, very good institutions and art centers and galleries and practitioners in general in Jutland and Fyn and all the other islands.
Non-Copenhagen areas.
Non-Copenhagen areas, So, I mean, I think it was just like, an obvious field to cover then, because no one else were really doing it.
Do you guys have a specific kind of plan or way to deal with that dance, which involves, as you were just talking now, I realized that you guys do two different things. You keep a pretty tight, I'm just going to call it academic for the sake of ease of labeling, an academic discussion about art and way of writing, but then also to something like Copenhagen Art Week, which is indeed very open and accessible to everybody, and also to different types of art. Lots of art which maybe you personally or the editorial staff wouldn't normally engage with, etc. And there's that dance, and it goes back to what we were talking about originally. This thing that art constantly has to justify its own exclusiveness or justify its own selection process, and that there's a certain trend of anti-intellectualism in art, and then there's a certain trend of like, well, what the fuck? Why can't we talk about very specific, fin kulturelt, they say in Danish, a very pointed, specific cultural discussion? And I don't really know how to deal with that discussion myself, where to take it. I know that for someone like me who speaks Danish as a second language, I have a really, really hard time reading what you guys write. Okay. It's very, very hard for me to absorb because I wasn't raised in that vernacular. No. Whereas I can in English, I can engage, but it's much harder for me in Danish. I don't begrudge you guys for it. I don't say like, you motherfuckers, you should be talking to me. But I can see that there's constantly questions about access and tone and discussion that one must pay attention to when you're talking about this sort of stuff. Yeah, I mean, actually, we've tried to be accessible in our language about it. Well, remember, it's my second language, and I didn't go to school here, so I'm a special case. No. So, I mean, that has been like a goal, and especially in our critical practice, like our art criticism, and I guess we are trying to be very diverse. I mean, we're trying to do all kind of things at the same time, and I guess now compared to earlier, we have two different access points to Kunsten.nu. There's art guide and there's journal, and that was one way of trying to make two doors. One that could just be like informative, guide you to stuff, and where you could meet like artist of the week, and maybe some small like news stuff. And then you would have the journal on the other side that would also be nerdy and address very specific questions within the arts and discuss that deeply. which needs to be done, no doubt about it.
Yeah. But it was kind of a way for us to kind of make that access point.
That's true, and I forgot to say that your art guide is excellent.
Good, thanks. And I mean, in a way, of course, we should all the time have a goal that is to, be an access point to a lot of new readers in our way of addressing arts. But I mean, it's a difficult task, but it's all the time there. I mean, that's how we think of it. And I mean, and Copenhagen Art Week is very inclusive. I agree, but it's also a way, and I think we're actually doing that. I mean, we are also selecting like who's in it to be the one that will guide you to, in our view, good, relevant. Artistic experiences.
Well, God knows we need curation.
Yes, and I mean, we have to take that responsibility. Also because we have like an art critical practice that is connected to the whole thing, and I think people in general would expect some kind of filtration or like selection.
Right, because otherwise it's just the internet.
Yeah, exactly.
If you don't have any sort of selection. And I mean, everything we do, whether it's which openings I'm going to go to on Friday or which podcasts I'm going to listen to, which whatever, it's a process of selection. Mm-hmm. And that's just how it is, and you have relationships with outlets who help you find things which you want to engage with, and that's, you can, again, I think it goes back to this idea that like, we don't have to constantly explain why we are doing what we're doing. We just try to do it the best we can.
Yeah.
And that's all there is to it.
Yeah. And I mean, it's, to me, I think it's very much like the Danish artist group Superflex. I mean, I like making tools, that art criticism can be a tool, and that Copenhagen Art Week can be a tool, and that art can be a tool for like thinking, a tool for expanding our thoughts and rethink our behavior and social life and politics and stuff like that. I mean, to me, it's very much about that. So I would always hope that people are able to apply it, I mean, if people have the feeling of not being able to use the things I'm doing, then I would be very sad, I mean, that's what why I do what I do.
Communication.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think that's a good place to end it. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for taking the time to come here and talk about it.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Undergang Armchair. The intro and outro music was kindly provided by Johnny Ripper, and today's interstitial music was provided by The Passion Hi-Fi. You can find links to their music and tons of other conversations with great people on our critical investigation of a website, undergang.net. Remember to let us know if you know anybody in Stockholm we should talk with next week. If you do like the show, we would appreciate it if you'd take the time to leave a review on iTunes so others can find us. The show is produced in part with the kind support of the Danish Arts Council. Thank you for joining us.